The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that weighed heavy, pressing down on everyone inside. A single cough echoed from the back, quickly swallowed by the tension hanging in the air. At the front, behind a massive wooden bench, Judge William M. Harrow adjusted his glasses, his cold blue eyes scanning the boy standing before him. The teen, barely 17, stood stiff, his hands gripping the edges of the defendant's table like he was holding on for dear life. His dark brown skin glistened under the harsh courtroom lights, and his eyes, wide, desperate, darted from face to face, searching for someone, anyone who would believe him. Jamal Carter wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this courtroom. Not in this situation. A promising student, a star basketball player, and most importantly, innocent. Yet here he was, accused of a crime he didn't commit. The evidence was shaky, the witnesses unreliable, but none of that seemed to matter. The prosecutor painted him as a dangerous young man, a threat to society, and Judge Harrow, he had already made up his mind. Jamal's mother, a strong woman who had raised him alone, sat in the front row. Her hands were clasped together, knuckles turning white as she prayed under her breath. She had told him to be strong, to trust in the system, to believe that the truth would set him free. But as he stood there, watching the way the judge Berliot looked at him, the way the jury avoided his gaze, he wasn't sure if the truth even mattered. Judge Harrow cleared his throat, shuffling some papers, before looking down at Jamal. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something old and deep-rooted. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice slow, deliberate, "the evidence against you is substantial. The testimonies place you at the scene. And while your defense insists otherwise," he let the words hang, almost as if he enjoyed the power he held in that moment. Jamal opened his mouth, ready to plead, to scream, to tell them they were wrong. But before he could, the judge continued. "This court finds you—" A noise, a shuffle in the back. The doors to the courtroom creaked open slightly, and a figure slipped inside. No one noticed at first. Not the judge, not the lawyers, not even Jamal. But someone was watching. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Someone who held the power to change everything. Jamal had no idea that his fate wasn't just in the hands of the judge. Someone else was about to make their presence known, and when they did, the truth would come crashing down like a tidal wave. But was it already too late? The courtroom air was thick, almost suffocating. As Jamal's heart pounded against his ribs, he was still standing there, frozen, his breath caught in his throat. He had been ready to hear the words that would seal his fate. But now, something had changed. He could feel it, like an unseen force, shifting the energy in the room. The figure who had slipped inside moved quietly, unnoticed by most, but not by everyone. In the front row, Jamal's mother suddenly lifted her head, as if sensing something. The man who had just entered wore a dark suit, his presence sharp, yet controlled. He didn't rush, didn't call attention to himself. Instead, he simply found a seat in the back, his eyes locking onto the judge with an intensity that sent a ripple through the air. Judge Harrow, about to speak the words that would change Jamal's life forever, hesitated for a fraction of a second. His fingers twitched slightly, his grip tightening on the wooden bench before him. He blinked, then cleared his throat again, as if trying to shake off whatever unease had settled over him. He glanced toward the back of the room, and for the briefest moment, his expression flickered. An emotion so quick, so buried, that most would have missed it. But Jamal saw it, and so did the man in the back. Jamal didn't know who this man was, but something told him that his presence was no accident. The tension in the room thickened as the judge regained his composure. "This court finds you." Before he could finish, the defense attorney shot to his feet. "Your Honor, before a ruling is made, I respectfully request to present new evidence." Gasps rippled through the room. The prosecutor turned sharply. "What?" she snapped, her voice laced with disbelief. "This is highly irregular, Your Honor. The defense has had ample time." Judge Harrow's jaw tightened, his gaze flickering toward the back again. The man in the suit hadn't moved, but his presence loomed over the room like a shadow. The judge exhaled slowly, his fingers curling against the bench. He had a choice to make, a simple one really. He could deny the request, push forward, send this boy away. It was what he had planned to do, what he always did in cases like this. But something about that man's gaze, something about the way the entire room seemed to shift around him, made him hesitate. "Approach the bench," the judge said finally, his voice strained but steady. Jamal's lawyer moved quickly, a file clutched tightly in his hands. He was nervous. Jamal could see the way his fingers trembled slightly as he laid the folder down in front of the judge. The prosecutor leaned in too, her lips pressed into a thin line of irritation. "This," the defense attorney said, his voice low, urgent, "is a security footage recording that was not included in the initial evidence presented by the prosecution. It was recovered by an independent investigator." He glanced, almost imperceptibly, toward the back of the room. "It proves that my client was nowhere near the crime scene at the time of the incident." Jamal's breath caught. He barely understood what was happening, but he knew that this was his last chance. Judge Harrow's fingers tapped against the desk. His jaw tightened, his mind racing. He should have denied it. He should have refused. But something told him that wasn't an option anymore. Not with that man watching. "Proceed," the judge said through clenched teeth. The defense attorney wasted no time. The footage played. The grainy security video flickered onto the screen in the courtroom. The room was silent as the images played. Silent except for the sharp inhale of Jamal's mother, the barely concealed murmurs rippling through the crowd. There, clear as day, was Jamal at a diner across town at the exact time of the crime. He was laughing, joking with his friends, completely unaware that his life was about to be turned upside down. The evidence was undeniable. The prosecutor's face paled. Judge Harrow remained still, his fingers twitching slightly against the bench. He had no choice now. The case was slipping out of his hands, unraveling in real time. Jamal felt his knees weaken. For the first time in weeks, hope surged in his chest. This was it. This was proof. He looked up at his mother, who had tears streaming down her face. But even as relief started to settle, something gnawed at the back of his mind. If this evidence existed all along, why hadn't it been presented sooner? And who was the man who had brought it forward now? Judge Harrow adjusted his glasses. His expression? Unreadable. He wasn't angry. No, this was something else. Something deeper. Fear. Jamal didn't know it yet, but the truth about his case went far beyond one night's mistake. It was bigger than him. Bigger than this courtroom. And someone very powerful, had just decided it was time for the truth to come out. But at what cost? The courtroom was no longer silent. Whispers filled the air like a rising storm, growing louder with each passing second. Jamal stood frozen, his eyes darting between the judge and the grainy footage that had just shattered every lie told about him. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break through his ribs. He was innocent. He had always been innocent. But now, finally, the truth was out. Judge Harrow sat stiffly on the bench, his face unreadable, his hands gripping the wooden surface so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He wasn't just watching the evidence. He was watching his own control slip away, and Jamal could see it. See the flicker of something dark in the judge's eyes. Was it panic? The prosecutor cleared her throat and forced a smile, though it barely held. "Your Honor," she said, her voice tight. "This evidence was not submitted earlier, which raises serious questions. The only question," Jamal's lawyer interrupted sharply, "is why this wasn't included in the original case files." He turned to the judge. "The prosecution had this footage. They buried it." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Jamal's mother clutched her hands over her mouth, her body trembling. Judge Harrow shifted in his seat. His expression hardened. "I will remind the court to remain calm." But his voice wasn't as steady as before. Jamal could barely breathe. It was unraveling. The truth. The lies. Everything. And then, from the back of the room, the man in the dark suit finally stood. The tension in the courtroom shifted instantly. He moved forward, slow and deliberate, his presence like a shadow stretching over everyone. He was calm, too calm, but his eyes were locked onto Judge Harrow with a weight that couldn't be ignored. "I believe it's time for full transparency," the man said, his voice smooth but firm. He pulled out a document, holding it up for everyone to see. "My name is Marcus Graves, federal investigator." A ripple of shock surged through the courtroom. Jamal felt his stomach drop. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing. This man had come here for a reason. Judge Harrow's face twitched, just barely, but enough for Marcus to catch it. "This document," Marcus continued, stepping closer, "is a record of case dismissals, sentencing patterns, and legal discrepancies, all tied to this courtroom." He placed the folder down in front of the judge. "Tied to you, Your Honor." Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. Jamal's breath hitched. He wasn't just on trial. This entire system was. Marcus turned to the crowd. "There's a reason this young man was about to be sentenced despite clear evidence of his innocence. Cases like his have been mishandled, manipulated, and buried for years." He looked back at the judge. But this time, someone was watching. The judge's lips parted, but no words came out. His face had drained of color. Jamal's lawyer, now emboldened, turned back to the courtroom. "Your Honor, given this new evidence, I demand all charges against my client be dismissed immediately." Judge Harrow hesitated. For the first time, he looked small, cornered. He glanced back at Marcus, as if weighing his options. Finally, after a long pause, he exhaled sharply. "This court finds the defendant, Jamal Carter, not guilty. All charges are dismissed." The courtroom erupted. Jamal felt his mother's arms wrap around him before he even had time to process the words. He was free. Free. But the weight in his chest didn't disappear completely. He turned, looking past the chaos, searching for Marcus, but the man in the dark suit was already walking away, slipping through the doors as quietly as he had entered. Jamal didn't know who he really was, or why he had chosen to help now. But as he stood there, feeling the relief wash over him, he realized something. Some people fight battles in the open, and some fight in the shadows, and sometimes justice needed both. As he stepped out of the courthouse, into the fresh air for the first time in weeks, he knew that his life would never be the same. Not because of what had almost happened, but because of what he now understood. The system had tried to break him, but the truth had won.